Yeah, unfortunately I don't have a clicker, I'm afraid, so I'm kind of tethered to the table today. Hi everyone and welcome to BC Aware for 2016. My name is Emma Sutcliffe. I work with the PCI Security Standards Council, and I was very lucky to be invited to come and do a presentation for you today. So do come in, grab a seat. No, it's all good. So what I'm going to focus on today is with respect to PCI, particularly PCI DSS is obviously the one that I think most people are interested in. But the focus that I really wanted to talk about was the collaboration side, the different parties involved, how to work together to really work towards a common goal. Just a little background about the Council for those who might not be too familiar with us. We were formed in 2006. We're intended as an open global standards body. We were founded by those 5 payment card brands that you can see on screen. The goal of the Council is to develop and maintain the security standards and the supporting programs and training that accompany those. The main confusion, I guess, or questions that we get around with respect to the roles of the Council and the payment brands is who does the compliance side of it. The 5 payment brands, and through their acquirers, if they have acquirer relationships, they're the folks who determine who has to comply, who has to validate, which report to fill out, when to fill out your report and when you need to submit it by. All of those kinds of questions, if you're a merchant, we encourage you to direct to your acquirer. If you work with the brand directly, then they're the people who can answer that question. From the Council point of view, we're really focused on, as I said, the security standards and the education and awareness piece that goes with those. The 3 sort of main areas that the Council does this work through is through collaborating with other industry bodies. We have a large participating organisation membership of about 700 organisations. We also do work with law enforcement and government agencies, other industry standards bodies such as INVICO and NIST in the US. Also merchant associations and acquiring associations. For those who have just come in, I was just giving a brief introduction to the Council and what our focus is. As I said, the main areas of our focus are really education and providing that training and awareness, and also providing accessibility to solutions that can help organisations reduce their risk and help them simplify their security and their compliance. I'll keep going while they've got people coming in. As I mentioned, PCI DSS is probably the standard most of you would be most familiar with, but we do obviously have other standards that cover other areas of the payments ecosystem. The card production and payment terminal side of it, we have standards for those for actually manufacturing secure devices, also for validating applications and software in the payment space that are secure. We also have point-to-point solution program, which sort of combines those things together to provide sort of an end-to-end assurance that you have a device and software and services that are meeting those requirements. So there's actually quite a lot of different standards that fit together under the sort of PCI banner. PCI DSS is obviously, as I said, the one that I think most entities find themselves exposed to just because of the nature of their business. Unfortunately, I guess the reason why the Council exists and the reason why we're all here is that hacking sensitive information is big business. The sort of breach reports that you see on the that are published and the information that we get, it seems that for the majority of hackers, financial gain is their motive, as opposed to corporate espionage or something similar. Sorry, is my stuff in the way there?
No.
Okay. And because hackers are looking to find data that can give them sort of financial gain that they can easily monetize, payment card data unfortunately falls into that category. Credit card information has always been a pretty popular source on the black market. The criminals who sort of steal and then market these stolen information are really quite sophisticated. They actually have pretty good customer service. They actually help their customers get the most out of their stolen numbers. They even have services to help validate the actual number is still going to be relevant for a particular period of time. So it's a pretty sophisticated market that they've got going on. As far as the value of card numbers seems to have dropped recently, like per card number. There's some sort of thinking behind this. It might be due to obviously increased security being put in some of the channels that these card numbers were previously used in, making them not quite as easy to get as much out of. The shift in the US from magnetic stripe to EMV is also sort of anticipated to have an impact. Potentially in the short term, that the value of those cards might be greater, but as they become less useful in other channels, then their value will drop. So it'll be interesting to see how that impacts where they target next. Just for interest's sake, the cost of a breach, obviously these are pretty scary figures. This is a report that the Ponemon Institute released, which was specifically focused on Canadian breach statistics. The thing I thought that was most interesting about this was that the average cost of a breach for a Canadian company was about $2 million higher than other companies that were in that global study that they did. The other countries that they did were like in Asia Pacific and Europe and the US. But the reason that this particular study found the Canadian cost per breach per company was higher was due to the cause of the breach being from a malicious individual or from a malicious target versus human error or a system glitch or some kind of sort of unawareness by the personnel. That's all types of breaches as well, not just payment card data. So that's any and everything breaches that this study collected info from. Looking at the threat environment, you can't help but know there seems to be this never-ending release of new technical threats. Some of the more recent ones target protocols like SSL, Heartbleed and Poodle, two examples of that. It's great having these little pictures, you don't have to write so much. But there's also evolving malware on all, targeting all elements of systems and technology. In the point-of-sale environment, point-of-sale terminals recently have really been targeted, and the malware is sort of now changing from targeting data in transit to data stored to data in memory, and actually scraping data out of the memory before it actually gets stored anywhere. So there's obviously, as these targets shift, so does the side to where to protect the information. As well as the threats, there's also a lot of new technical opportunities that organisations want to adopt to help them improve their processes, help their customer service. Mobile in particular is a really big challenge at the moment. Obviously mobile is really taking off on all aspects of people's lives. And for a merchant who wants to use those mobile platforms, potentially to accept credit card information or to accept payments, it's a real challenge to secure these devices. They're really built for, obviously, functionality and service, and they really didn't have a lot of security built into them. So that's an area that we're really focusing on. Another one up here is the EMV chip. As I mentioned, what's what, sorry?
EMV.
EMV?
These are, P2P.
Oh, yeah, sorry, okay. Let me go through these then for you. I'm sorry about that. EMV it actually stands for Europay MasterCard Visa. That's just the companies in Europe who first created the chip card for chip and PIN transactions primarily. P2PE is point-to-point encryption. Some people call it end-to-end encryption. We find that there's so many long words, we just make everything an acronym, so I do apologise for not explaining that.
We don't know that.
The EMV one isn't necessarily new technology for Canada. Canada's had chip cards for a long time. However, other regions are only just beginning to migrate from magnetic stripe to chip cards. So there's a lot of interest in how that's going to affect other payment channels in other regions, particularly e-commerce. Some regions are more sophisticated with their e-commerce anti-fraud measures than others, so they're expecting them to be targeted.
Was that a choice of the 5 brands in each country as to which country goes first?
I don't believe it's just the brands. There's obviously banking systems and financial regulators, and there's a whole bunch of considerations that each region has. Europe, for example, has very different laws with respect to sharing information than other areas. The US, one of the reasons that they haven't migrated to chip before now is at least partly due to the mass and volume of legacy systems in their banking. They also have 50 states that each have different banking systems. Canada obviously is a little more simplified. We've got a few big ones, and the structure, I guess, is a little newer. Same with Europe. I mean, they obviously had a similar, decentralization of their banking systems, but they managed to do it over the last sort of 15 years or so. So it's not just the brands. Yeah.
Hope I didn't misunderstand this, but is the implication there that the European chip technology is different from the North American?
No, it's just North America hasn't adopted chip technology yet. Well, sorry, the USA hasn't. Canada obviously has. The USA is now migrating to chip technology from magnetic stripe. If you take your Canadian credit card to the US, you have to swipe it. They don't have chip readers in many places yet. They're beginning to now because the migration really started last year, towards the end of last year. So this year and the next year, they're expecting it to really take force. So yeah, EMV is just, like I said, that's the common terminology for it. EMVCO is the standards body that defines the standard for the protocols that chip technology uses for payment cards. It just happened to be 3 European payment card brands who put their name to it. Yeah.
I noticed you haven't got the RFID as a new opportunity on the attack.
Yeah, that is another one that kind of ties a little bit into mobile. It also ties a little bit into tokenization because both those technologies are used in that. But yeah, the protocol itself is another one, NFC, the tapping of a card or a phone to a reader, anything like that. So yeah, these are just some of them that people are looking at how to adopt. And my point for showing this was really just that while like many organisations want to go out and adopt this and make the most of these new technologies and the benefits they bring, we've also got to make sure that we understand the security implications of them and how security has to be applied to keep them doing what they're intended to do. So let me keep going. I don't want to go past my time. As well as the threats and opportunities, another sort of complexity with payment card is the relationships. This is a really simplified example of what a typical transaction might look like. A cardholder or a consumer brings their card to a merchant. It could be a storefront where they physically dip their card. It could be an e-commerce website where they type it in. It could be over the phone. It could be a standalone petrol kiosk that's unattended. The merchant then works with their acquiring bank, who goes through the payment card brand networks, checks with the cardholder's issuer that the cardholder has the credit, the issuer approves the transaction, the merchant then gets paid, and then the cardholder gets billed. So that's just really simple of the key players that you'll often find in a payment transaction. But unfortunately, each of these key players could each have their own interactions with other companies. Merchants, for example, will often have service providers providing IT or support services. They might have data hosting or web hosting through a third party. The acquiring banks will often use third parties to manage the payment terminals for their merchants. So that's a whole other organisation that's directly in the merchant environment, managing and installing those systems. On the financial network side, those top three, there's a lot of other organisations involved for things like transporter transactions and interoperability between networks. So there's a lot of other parties that jump in there. And then on the issuer side, many issuers will outsource the production of the payment card to another company, and even potentially managing their cardholder accounts. So, whichever industry you're in, whichever kind of business you fall under, it's just, one of the key things is to understand all your relationships. And they're not always the obvious ones that you think are tied to your payment cards. It's often other service provider relationships or partners that can have an impact on your payment security. The good news is that breaches can be prevented. Yeah.
So I'm guessing like the simplified network was is fairly secure, and then the other problems you say might come from the other partnerships. How does a company, on whichever side of those you are, how do you find or screen out the right companies to partner with? Well,
I wouldn't say that by itself is just secure. It's just less complex. Generally, once you add more companies, it becomes more complex. The security will depend on each individual organisation and how they manage that. With respect to third-party relationships, it's very important to have an onboarding process for these engagements when you partner with a company. Do the due diligence. Make sure that you have written agreements that support the security needs of your company and that both parties understand who's responsible for what and what to do if something changes. So it is certainly an important part of it. Okay. These two documents here, if you're interested, they do have a lot of really good information in them. Verizon produces these every year. I am not plugging Verizon, but they do have a data breach investigation report. Trustwave also do a breach investigation report, which is very interesting. And they do a PCI compliance report. So if you are interested specifically in if you're working in the compliance part of your company, you can get a lot of good information out of these. They do a lot of interesting analysis of statistics. It's different every year, so you can't always compare it year to year, but it is interesting. These are the ones from 2015. The 2016 one's not out yet, so most of the information from here is from 2014. But as well as obviously the statistics about the fact that many breaches could have been preventable, the vulnerabilities had been out for a long time that helped provide an access point to a network. The fact that response and detection is really an area that organisations struggle with, so a breach can actually be there longer than it needs to be. Another interesting thing that we found in this recent report is that many of the larger breaches actually involve, what's the term they use, a multi-step approach to the attack, where a system was targeted in order just to gain access, and then from there they actually gained access to the target system. So the target system itself, has been protected, but it's these other systems that the attackers can use as a step to get into the network. And from a PCI DSS point of view, that's particularly interesting when you start thinking about scope. I'm going to touch on that in a sec. These are 4 of the main areas that companies seem to struggle with, as evidenced in these sort of breach reports. Not just the Verizon ones, there are other ones as well. As I said, logging and monitoring is a DSS requirement that a lot of people struggle with, but it's also why there's a lot of delayed in detection of a breach. So there's actually a direct correlation there. Patches and software maintenance, as I said, vulnerabilities not getting patched within a reasonable time. They are still getting breached, a year after a vulnerability was announced. People are still getting those exploited. So the patches have been around for a while. The security governance is an interesting one because this is one that's really tied to the people and the processes and the culture of an organisation, and actually having, leadership for a security program and kind of building that into at all levels. And then access controls. Did you guys see that Splash Data, I think the name of the company was, released their worst passwords of 2014 in the last few days? Anyone have a guess of what the top 2 were?
Password 1, 2, 3.
Close. One was password, all lowercase, and the other was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because often they have a 6-character minimum. So, for those of us in the security industry, I think we're good for a while as far as having our jobs. But it's not just weak passwords that are the problem, and obviously that's a user education thing. Another, recurring issue is having too much elevated privilege. Having administrative access when you don't need administrative access, when someone changes jobs, not removing their privilege to, previously sensitive information they needed access to. And then remote access is another big area where access controls fall down. People seem to forget about, the access that's coming from outside from their, their vendors or their providers. Their maintenance of their systems, for example, may have remote access. So often they're focused on the folks inside the building and not those coming in from outside.
In that, I think Verizon's report, they say the average time for discovery a breach is over 200 days.
Yeah.
And the question is, when a company gets breached, like some Hyatt, the payment system was breached a few months ago, do those companies lose their PCI compliance status or not?
Well, again, compliance is for the payment brands and the acquirers to determine. These reports, the Verizon ones in particular, because Verizon also do a compliance report as well as a breach report, they actually do, as I said, cross-analysis of the information they collect. And that's only the breaches that one company investigates. So, it's obviously a limited pool, but it's the breaches that company look at. And their recent report says that none of the companies they investigated were actually compliant at the time of the breach. They may have been registered as compliant because they filled out their SAQ and submitted it and signed it, but when the forensic report, the forensic investigators went in and then looked at the systems, there were failings in security controls that are in PCI DSS, so they hadn't been met. But the status is up to the acquirer side to figure out. Okay. So if you look at the anatomy of a breach, there's usually 4 steps. These vary. This is, again, the simple process. Yeah.
Sorry about
That's
that.
all right.
So if a company is found to be in breach of, like they weren't up to standard, what kind of liability can there be from the company?
Liability is another tough question. It can vary from country to country. It can depend on the details of the contracts they have with whoever it is that's claiming against them. From the council's point of view, that's really outside again of the area that we can comment on. We're just trying to do the standards and the security guidance, and I know it's frustrating when you hear someone from the council say that a lot. Like, we can't answer that question, or it can depend. But ultimately, each region is different. Each payment brand has different operating regulations that have different requirements in them. Each acquirer may have a different agreement for their merchants. So. It really is something that, we'd encourage each organisation to understand for themselves where their liability is.
Yeah. That question a little bit differently.
Yeah.
If a company had a breach but they were found to be fully in compliance of the PCI securities, what is their level of
liability? Most of the payment brands use that as, they used to call it safe harbour. They might be more lenient on fees, because at least that company was making a concerted effort to secure. There was no negligence, if you like. From a legal point of view, liability, yeah, I can't comment. It'd be interesting if and when that happens, because I'm sure someone will try and sue us for it. They're saying we followed your standard and we got breached, so therefore we're blaming you. That's going to happen, I'm sure, at some point. Yeah, like I said, we're trying just to keep separate from that and obviously advise, against having it in too many legal issues, if possible. Yeah.
And when we looked into the consequences of having a breach, the fines were there and they're a concern, but it was nowhere near the concern of having our merchant level raised and having our per transaction percentages
interchange
increased.
rates,
Right, those could cost us millions and millions of dollars. So that was our big concern, is not the fine so much.
Yeah, and that's how the brands sort of manage that, and each one has their different policies. So, yeah.
So for an organization doing the SAQ, so PCI has a prioritized approach as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they have like 1 through 6 in terms of
Milestones. Yep.
So let's say an organization is has most of those number 1 and 2 priority controls met, but then there are like quite a few that are in a remediation plan. Would that organization be able to claim that they are PCI DSS compliant at that stage, or?
Well, any organisation can claim anything. Again, the council doesn't monitor compliance. We don't get reports or SAQs. We don't go on site and look at organisations. Merchants need to report to their acquiring bank or their brand, and that's where that is maintained, and that's where the checks and balances are done. We can provide the documentation and the resources to do that, but it's really up to those relationships to make that determination. Okay. So as I was saying, generally 4 steps to a breach. Obviously, you want to have security at all of these levels. A lot of security programs focus on the perimeter security and try and stop phase 1, try and stop the bad guys getting in, which is great, but it's not the be-all and end-all. It kind of goes back to the armadillo equation. We have crunchy on the outside and soft and squishy in the middle. Once they're in, as I said, they'll often target systems that aren't necessarily the sensitive ones in order to get in, and that's when they can start inserting malware, start looking around, elevating some privileges, getting access to what they want to. They'll often move sensitive information from the system it's on to somewhere else that's more accessible for them to actually then be able to remove that information from the network. And when they actually do remove it, they'll often encrypt it so you can't detect it if you have DLP systems up, and they'll often try and cover their tracks. So there's obviously a lot of different areas that security can be applied to try and not just prevent the attack, but also detect it more quickly and respond to it more quickly and contain it more quickly. This is just the overview of the PCI DSS requirements. If you're not familiar with them, I'm sure many of you are. But the point of this was just to really show that this is really intended to help all of those areas, not just the perimeter security area. There's ongoing monitoring and logging, regular testing, policies and governance, so all of that is in there. So even if you don't need to do PCI DSS, we certainly recommend it as a starting point if you're looking for a security framework. Is there a question? Nope.
Are these slides going to be available later on?
I think so. I'm not sure. I'll have to check with the organisers, sorry. Another challenge that a lot of folks have with PCI is not so much just, or not only, how the requirements apply to them, but where they have to apply the requirements in an organisation. This one I brought up again because of that earlier statistic about it's not the system in the CDE, or it's not the system that actually stores or processes payment card data that's being targeted. It's another system, which is then used to access the system that stores or accepts or processes payment card data. And this is the PCI DSS has a fairly detailed scoping section in it to try and help sort of provide direction in this area. And obviously, again, from a security point of view, you want to make sure that if a system has access to a sensitive part of the network, that system has security on it, so that it's not providing an access point to an unauthorized channel. And this is, again, just the guiding principles. If you want a system to not be in scope at all for PCI DSS, then you want to have a high level of assurance that that system can be compromised and it won't impact the security of your payment environment, which is obviously not ideal either, but that's kind of what it comes down to. These are 4 of the sort of common areas that people seem to struggle with. One is about where in the organisation is responsibility for information security, not just PCI. Knowing where the actual data is that needs protecting, relying on vendors, without necessarily doing the due diligence, And then also the balance of understanding what compliance can mean if you're talking about filling out a report and signing it versus, does that meet your level of security need?
Can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
I do security consulting work, and it constantly amazes me how many organizations, fairly large organizations in Canada and the US, are answering the question for their I am compliant because they think they filled out a self-assessment questionnaire and they've interpreted that they are compliant. And when you look at it, there's no way they're compliant. But no one seems to be checking it.
Yeah,
which I'm finding,
it's tough.
really disconcerting when you think, some of these organizations are really quite large, and yet they're not compliant.
Yeah.
Truly not compliant. So, who should be? I mean, should it be? I'm assuming it should be the credit card companies.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like to think every organisation has to take responsibility for themselves to some extent. If that organisation, doesn't if it's a small company, we get it. They don't have the resources for security specialists. They don't have, a complex structure where they can hire a department to look after this for them. And that's where, they can, do due diligence, build relationships, get validated products, do the most they can do to minimise their own overhead for looking after this. For organisations that are larger, and do have the sophistication to have security departments and, risk office and all those kinds of things, they like to think it's their call, it's their decision, but ultimately, as you said, the payment brands and the acquirers, they're the ones who, decide whether to accept the risk or not of that organisation. So it's really down to those relationships to determine that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm finding that this is the issue I'm finding is when you sit down and talk to them about the steps to compliancy and you look at PCI, the various steps, and they say, well, what is that going to cost us to become compliant?
Yeah.
And then you somehow say, well, it's going to be a minimum of $100,000 by the time you do this. They automatically shove it back in the drawer because they don't have the money to do it. Or there's no recognition at the board level that they think it's worth the risk.
Yeah.
But no one seems to be putting pressure on them because there's no real legislation either.
And there's two-edged swords to all of those. Legislation has its benefit of, compliance programs have the same benefit of, encouraging organisations to force them to do it. But then at some point, compliance becomes the goal instead of actually understanding your security posture. So, we have to make sure that, where we fit in is supporting that and not, stepping over it. Yeah.
And just to follow on to the previous question, that so do the payment brands or acquirers ever audit the completed SAQs, or does it vary depending on?
Each payment brand does have their own compliance program. I know that some of the brands who are represented on the council's working groups are actually involved in reviewing report on compliances. SAQs, I don't know so much. The report on the compliance is when you need the external assessor to come in and do the full audit report.
So because that's where the QSA is coming in, that's understandable. It's been audited by a third party, right? But SAQs?
Some do. At least one brand is recently upping their mandate for small merchants to start submitting SAQs and actually get their acquirers to start checking them. They'd started with the big organisations and they're kind of filtering down now to the smaller ones. So depending on which brand you're looking at, they do have their own programs for small merchants and some are beginning to ramp up a bit faster than others.
So what you're saying is that the brand is the only one that can say a company is compliant or not? It's not the council?
The council doesn't know.
The council doesn't put any fines or penalties?
No. No.
But the payment brands?
The payment brands can, and the acquiring banks can, if the acquiring bank is doing that role for that payment brand. We look at the standards and we provide, the goal of the council is to provide the resources to help organisations do that. So we have the standards, we have reporting templates, we have training programs. I was going to get into all that a bit later, but I can cover that now. We have a lot of resources to help organisations get there. And any organisation can do a self-assessment and say, yes, I've met the requirements, I'm compliant, I'm secure. That's their call. But ultimately, if there is a breach, then it's going to be on them. So that's why I kind of like each organisation at some point to take responsibility and understand their.
But the payment brand is the one.
Payment brands do the mandates. Yeah.
There's also a few states, right, that require.
Yeah, in the US, a couple of states have introduced legislation. 2 or 3, I think. I'm not sure. Maybe there's more now. They were talking about doing it in South Africa as well, so that's something they've been discussing. Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see how it goes. I'll keep going through these because these are sort of areas where, it kind of comes down to the theme of, I guess, working with everybody, for the common goal. The IT department, I guess, has traditionally been, where information security gets lumped. But obviously, hopefully, more people are realising that's not really the case. There are business units who are controlling the people who are accepting payment card information, so they need to be involved, in a payment card security program. And it's also, people and processes that have the ability to interact with the payment card environment, not necessarily as part of their day-to-day job, but, if there's a need for someone, for example, to check up an account, they may have access for an occasional purpose. So all of those sorts of different flows and connections need to be understood. The knowing where your information is, this is an old statistic, but I still like it because it's still relevant, maybe not to that extent of 66%. But even the breach reports from 2014 still had cases where breached entities didn't know the data was on the system that was being breached. The examples that they cited in these reports included where a third party was sort of hosting their web environment and the third party hosting provider had activated logging, capturing transaction information that the merchant didn't realise that the hosting provider was doing as part of their service, and that was the data that got captured. And another one was where debug logs are turned on, for troubleshooting purposes, and they're not turned off, and then those logs just, get big and stay there and someone breaks in and finds them. So it's still relevant. This is where, we really encourage the use of data flow diagrams. Requiring a data flow is required by PCI DSS, but often they're not sort of regularly checked or kept up to date. It's often the case that, they're looked at once a year when the assessor comes in or when you get the note from the acquirer saying it's time to do your compliance again. Data flows, also need to look at the what-if types of scenarios. So if you have your regular, transaction process environment and that goes down, let's say your website goes down, how does your company accept payments during that time? Do you have like a call centre that opens up and you're taking them over the phone or taking more over the phone? If the point of sale terminal goes offline, if the network's down, a payment card's written down temporarily and then put through the system later. So, as well as the standard operating practices, you also need to consider the failover or the backup systems that could come online. If something goes down, what's going to come up to replace it? And this is where sort of interdepartmental communication really comes in. Hopefully with the larger organisations, they have someone who's keeping track of their sensitive data flows, and they can obviously then set up a regular meeting to talk to all the departments and just make sure that those data flows are still the same, and that the department hasn't suddenly started using a new third-party service provider that needs to be considered, or something like that. Once you know where the data is, you can obviously then make sure you're protecting it, but you can also then look at any alternatives to reducing the volume that you have. And, this comes down to things like, not storing the full PAN if you don't need the full PAN. The PAN is the payment account number. It's the 15 or 16-digit number on the card. If you don't need to store that whole number, you just need the last 4 digits, for example, that's a lot less value to an attacker. They can't do much for those last 4 digits, but they can do a lot with the full number and the expiry date. So look at ways to, reduce the amount of sensitive information you're storing, and then obviously you can hopefully reduce the overhead of securing that because you don't have as many systems that it's on, for example.
I suppose tokenization would really help with that last point as well. Is the council kind of looking into mandating tokenization in the future, or where is that kind of sitting?
Tokenization is one of those new technologies that, well, I say it's new. It's been around for a while, but it's getting to the point where it's becoming more, widely used. There are no current industry standards on tokenization, like protocols. From the council's point of view, we have produced a guidance document on developing secure tokenization products. It sort of covers the security principles that should be built within the tokenization engine. It's guidance, it's not a validation program. And we're also working with EMVCo for tokens that are on chip cards to provide security requirements for the token service providers. And that's really at the back end. That's not the merchant side. That's really in the financial institution side, who are actually getting those tokens onto chip cards to make sure that they have secure environments as well.
That brings up a really, really interesting question for me. With Apple Pay and with Google Wallet, if Apple or Google are kind of found negligent, would the merchant kind of be at risk there, or would it be Apple or Google that way?
I don't know the answer to a negligent liability question, but I would suggest it would be whoever it is that provided the data, or the consumer ultimately, so it depends what insurance they have or what agreement they have with their card carrier. But I mean, the mobile wallet thing is also something that we're looking at this year with respect to the provisioning side. So not so much the acceptance side. When a merchant receives, you know, an Apple Pay or a Android Pay or one of the other ones, they don't necessarily know if it's a credit card number or a token of a credit card number. It just looks the same. It gets processed through the same. You know, the merchant doesn't really know any different necessarily. But when it comes to actually issuing those numbers to the consumer, that's where we're looking at, you know, where we can, you know, provide security requirements for those companies who are actually managing that process.
That's a very good question. I think I was thinking the same when you had that relationship diagram on where does it extend to. I think currently it's large focus on merchant, but the issuer...
The issuing side, is becoming much more in the forefront. And it's kind of like a shift of security, really, because instead of necessarily focusing on protecting the data that's sensitive in a merchant environment, if the merchant's now getting data that's not sensitive because it's tokenized, then the attack's going to come over here with the provisioning of the token. You know, so we found with Apple Pay had some in the news as well that you know, the attackers are targeting the registration process. So they're basically pretending to be a cardholder in order to get a token for that cardholder, then they're going and spending all their money. So there are still, you know, weak points in the process. Just because we've solved this problem here, you know, we can't forget about, well, this is where they're going to start attacking now over here. So yeah, so it's very interesting. Keeps us all on our toes, and you, I'm sure. How much time have I got left? Oh yeah, got a little bit. This is what comes back to the third parties, partnering with trusted experts. You know, obviously, if you're using a service provider to provide a security service or to maybe you're outsourcing part of your payment environment, you obviously want to make sure that they're meeting the security needs of your company. If you're partnering with providers who, you know, claim that they have PCI DSS compliance, they've done their full assessment, then, you know, still take that next step and actually verify what coverage their PCI DSS covers. Some companies will, you know, cover it for certain services, but not customization of that service, for example. Others may only cover a subset of the requirements because they're only focused on providing, for example, a secure physical facility, and they don't necessarily have any kind of firewall controls or anything in there, so you need to make sure you're doing those yourselves. So make sure that you know, have these agreements, you know, talk through this with your third-party providers, and write it all down so that both parties have the same information, so both parties understand who's responsible for what. And if something changes, you know, make sure there's open communication there. So if a provider, for example, does a process differently and that impacts, you know, their consumers, their customers, I should say, it's important that they keep that communication open. Yep.
This is the first step, so verification of you know, compliance.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say using a service provider and they don't have to get the QSA audit, then just verifying their security completion, or how does that be?
And that can depend on the relationship and the type of service. You know, if the service provider's, you know, providing something that they can show, you know, that, let's say they're managing a system or something that you're storing data on, they can show you that they're patching that system, they're keeping it up to date, they can show that it's, you know, gone through this, that or the other. If they're doing a self-assessment, then they, you know, depending on what your agreement is with them, you could ask for their attestation of compliance. It's a self-assessment though. Whether that's acceptable to you or not is something you want to know before you engage with that provider, so you can, you know, make that risk decision on whether that's acceptable or whether you want to go with someone who will agree to do, you know, an external assessment. You know, with respect to whether it's acceptable from a compliance point of view, that's a question for the brands, whether they say you have to use providers with QSAs or do self-assessments. That's kind of where our line stops and the brand line starts. But you know, this is what really comes back to that, you know, due diligence and open communication channels with all the people all the companies that you're interacting with. The third part of that, I just want to mention, because this is, and you may have seen this in the news as well, access to third parties has been like a major factor in a number of breaches recently, where, you know, the third-party company has access to the organisation's network, you know, potentially to do something nothing to do with payment card information. You know, they could be doing, I don't know, air conditioning maintenance, for example. But that channel not being secured by the company because they don't feel it's relevant to them, to their security, then provides an access point for someone to get in who can then, as I said, jump from point to point and get to the good stuff. You know, so, you know, really make sure that your third-party access is controlled. Least privilege applies just as it does to internal people. You know, if you change providers, obviously cut that access off pretty quickly. You know, and make sure that you're applying the same level of strong authentication to your third parties that you do for your internal employees. Compliance and security, a lot of people think these are as opposing objectives. You'll often see compliance versus security, I think, in articles. I actually think compliance is a pretty useful tool within a bigger security program. Compliance provides you with that checkpoint, that you're on the right track, that you're doing the right thing, and it also provides you information if you're not, so you can identify where there's potentially something going to fall down so you can fix it. So from that point of view, it does have value. When you're doing a compliance assessment for PCI DSS, these are the kinds of things that you're verifying, that you have policies and procedures, that the people understand the policies and procedures, and that you have looked at some systems to make sure they're configured according to those policies. That obviously doesn't future-proof you against changes. If personnel, stop following the processes because something's changed in their business operation and they're now going through a different path, a new vulnerability gets released that you haven't detected. I mean, all of those things could still happen, and your compliant finding from yesterday, was really only valid for yesterday. But again, this is where they come together. If you're maintaining sort of compliance as a continual sort of process, then that can help be an element that feeds back into your overall security program. This is kind of the opposite of that, where you do compliance as like your periodic annual assessment, or perhaps you do it more frequently than that, but annually is the norm, where you get to, you first try and reach compliance, you implement a whole lot of new procedures, a whole lot of new operations, new technology. You get to the point where you have a good level of security and you've met your compliance requirement. Then you get back into regular business. It starts to sort of, ebb off a bit. One or two controls, because if you're looking at PCI DSS, obviously the controls cover a wide area, so one or two controls don't work so well, you might not get, an immediate issue because you've got other controls in place. But at some point, the quality of the control management will get to the point where an attacker, can actually utilise that. Hopefully your next compliance assessment will come around before that happens so that you can pick them all up again. And hopefully as the process goes forward, each time the bar gets raised a little higher, because you might identify where there was a problem system or a problem area, so you fix it more proactively. But that attack threshold is always getting higher as well. So what we're obviously trying to do is avoid this sort of peak and trough or ebb and flow approach, and kind of have it more a straighter, more consistent line that supports not just the compliance but also the security. These are some of the challenges of people, why a lot of organisations fail to maintain the security in between compliance assessments. Obviously they focus on that annual check mark so they can get the pat on the back from their bank and then move on. There's also the day-to-day business operations. I mean, customer and business demands for new products, for better services, and security is usually something that takes a back seat when you're looking at those priorities. Obviously, we would recommend that you build security into the very, very early stages of planning for any kind of new project or initiative or product if you develop products, because that's obviously a lot easier than trying to go back and retrofit something later. And another challenge is with respect to sort of understanding and being aware of and adapting to the changing environment, particularly with threats. And an example of that is the SSL TLS evolution, I guess, over the last few years. SSL obviously very heavily relied on in e-commerce and a lot of other industries, but particularly e-commerce. SSL was replaced 18 years ago, I think, with the first version of TLS. But TLS 1.2 has been out for 7.5 years. So it's been around for a while. It's still secure. It was actually brought out to address a lot of security issues with SSL in the earlier version of TLS. And yet, when PCI DSS was updated last year to say that, you can't use SSL anymore, it's not secure, that was when a lot of people only started looking at this for the first time. And as I said, TLS 1.2 has been out for 7.5 years, and it was released to address security issues. So, it's one of those things that the security focus, rather than just that annual check, could have really helped with their planning here. Just a side note on that, we released an update in December about the migration dates for SSL. So if you're actually one of the companies who are trying to migrate away from SSL or TLS 1.0, do check the announcement on the website if you haven't seen it, because that's all getting updated this year. And I'm about hitting my time. I just had a couple more really points, just focusing on the people side of the organisation. This is the main one that I wanted just to touch on that subject. Obviously, a lot of people recognise that it has to come from the top. If a security program is going to be effective, it has to be in the culture of the organisation, so it has to have the support of the executive and senior management. what a lot of companies forget is that you also need to have that reverse communication flow as well. The people who are on the front line, who are potentially accepting your payment cards, working on the systems where the data is, these are the folks who are going to give you the information about what processes are working, what aren't. If a security process isn't workable, then they're going to bypass it. So get that input from the frontline staff. They can also identify potential issues that management might not see, and actually that can feed back into like your security program, you know, for the company as a whole. So make sure that communication is both ways. Well, that's pretty much the main thing I wanted to cover. I do have sort of some slides just on the resources that are available on the PCI website. We do have a lot of information supplements and papers and best practices that cover different technologies. We have a frequently asked questions page, which has a lot of sort of good information in it, and you can submit a question through that page as well if you have one. If you do have a question, do search the page first though, because we get a lot of these questions and a lot of them come back as FAQs on the website, so do check that out. You can also find listings of secure payment devices that have been validated by a lab, of software that's gone through validation, and of assessors if you're looking for a security assessor to help with your DSS. So yeah, do go to the website, find what you need there, submit a question, and that's it. Thank you.